Continuing on with our cycles, we'll talk about the phosphorus cycle. Phosphorus cycle is actually, I think, the easiest of all the cycles because cycling is super slow. It tends to be pretty local, so it's not widespread. So if phosphorus in one area, it tends to stay in that area. It cycles through the food web and aquatic terrestrial systems. To note, there is no phosphorus in the atmosphere. So that is a big like star circle highlight. Um, I would say the most important part of phosphorus cycling is that phosphorus gets locked up in nucleic acids. So DNA and RNA have phosphorus in them. If you remember back to like biology, you right DNA is made up of nucleotides, and the nucleotides are one sugar, one phosphate, and one nitrogen base. And so that phosphate is locked in there. ATP also, right, is usable form of energy for living organisms, and it stands for adenosine triphosphate. So obviously there's phosphate in there. It's an essential element for life and is also a limiting nutrient for plant growth. So if you look at fertilizers, usually you have NPK on there. N for nitrogen, P for phosphorus, and K for potassium. And so those are usually the limiting nutrients, the macronutrients that you're looking at for plant growth. So phosphorus is usually pretty stable and insoluble, meaning that it's not available as much as other elements are. Um, so small amounts of phosphorus returns to land as guano. So looking at right, bats excrete guano along with fish-eating birds, and so that guano returns back to the land. Weathering actually returns phosphorus to the soil as well. So taking a rock and weathering it down, adding it into the soil, and also phosphatizing bacteria. So bacteria that take their food source and actually create phosphorus as a waste product. Again, phosphorus does not exist in the atmosphere, and we mine large quantities of phosphate rock to make fertilizers and some detergents, although we've cut that back quite a bit because we have no way of treating phosphorus in the wastewater. Or at least most don't. As we remember from wastewater, we did primary and secondary treatment. You would have to add in a tertiary treatment to do phosphorus treating, which is actually kind of rare. I think unless you're on a river, you really don't do that. Um, Phosphorus is lost from ecosystems through runoff because it's in the soil, in the sediment, um, through precipitation and sedimentation. And we add more phosphorus into waterways than is naturally there, mostly because of animal waste and fertilizers. And so it is a major contributor of eutrophication because, like I said, phosphorus is a limiting factor in freshwater systems. So it causes a lot of algal growth in freshwater systems. And so here's a little like depiction of the phosphorus cycle. You guys can go through it again, take a look at it. Um, but as you can notice, there's nothing in the atmosphere up here. Okay. Okay. Next up is sulfur. Sulfur is an essential component of protein. So when you look at amino acids, sulfur is a key component. And the molecular bridges that hold the proteins in their shape. And so they're locked into our tissues for through this process. Um, Sulfur is also important in determining the acidity of your precipitation. So acid rain, right? We worry about sulfur dioxide being emitted through combustion of fossil fuels into the atmosphere that then combines with the water in the atmosphere, and then we end up with acidic rain or acidic precipitation, I should say. Um, and so um, sulfur can circulate as hydrogen sulfide. A lot of bacteria are involved in hydrogen sulfide. Sulfur dioxide, right? We're combusting material that has sulfur within it, and that's giving us sulfur dioxide, sulfate, and elemental sulfur. So natural sulfur gets released through volcanic eruptions, but otherwise, sulfur cycling is actually pretty slow. Um, We are releasing large quantities of sulfur through, like I said, combusting sulfur containing coal. So a lot of bituminous coal and oil, and lots of industrial processes emit sulfur dioxide that ends up in our atmosphere. And so here you go. Here's another little depiction. You guys can take a look at it if that helps. Um, Water cycle is something that you guys probably know from way, way back in elementary school. So, just the big ones are like surface water, rivers, streams, groundwater. And then precipitation. So there's precipitation, evaporation from the surface water or off the land. There's also transpiration or evapotranspiration from plants that are putting out water, because water is a waste product of respiration. So there is water that comes through the leaves of plants and that gets evaporated. So water coming out of the leaf is called transpiration, and that evaporates off. So we call it evapotranspiration. So there's precipitation, evapotranspiration, evaporation. And so it cycles through all of those four spheres that we talked about at the beginning of the PowerPoint. Right. So here's, like I said before, right? Evaporation, evapotranspiration, condensation, precipitation, infiltration, right? Where it's going into the Earth's surface, percolation, where it descends down underneath the root zone, so into groundwater, and then runoff. So very fairly simple. And here's another little picture, if this helps at all, to try and get the water cycle in your head. We obviously need water because we're alive. Everything that's alive really needs water. Um, and we intervene in the water cycle, and we've talked about that through our water consumption and diversion and, making dams and reservoirs, irrigation for our crops, and also just basic daily needs like washing, drinking, and bathing. Agriculture is the greatest water consumer. And which we've talked about before. And so a lot of the world does not have potable water or drinkable water. So that is one of the most pressing problems in the world. There is definitely a water crisis worldwide. Remember, babies are dying from waterborne illness, and you flush your toilet. I do too, but right, we flush our toilets with drinkable water. And so, that's definitely a concern around the world.